Well, we have such a wonderfully crowded room today. This is great. Glad so many people came. Though I looked at the other sessions that were happening now and I was like, oh man, I want to go over there. So it's all good. It's all good. The good news is if you really want to know a lot more about passkey, you can look that up, but I don't know anywhere that this information is actually available online, not in any one place. So I will go ahead and get us started. So my name is Heather Flanagan. Many of you know me. I wear a lot of different hats, so you may actually know me from any number of different scenarios. Now, one of those things those hats have in common is that the organizations I work with or that I volunteer with are all about, in some way, shape, or form, about internet standards and making the internet better. So I was the RFC series editor for 8 years, providing executive oversight to the publication of RFCs. I've been an invited expert with the W3C. I'm actually currently a community group chair with the W3C, so I'm still pretty active in that community as well. I'm a member of the OpenID Foundation. I am a founding member of IDPro, and I'm a technical writer for ICANN, so that's in the DNS space. And I've even enjoyed working a few years back with the Kantara initiative and the Digital Identity Authentication Council of Canada, back when the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework was a glint in their eye. But wait, there's more. I also work with the research and education community on SAML federations. I actually work for ReFeds, which is a global consortia of academic federations from around the world. Now, with all of these organizations, I don't write the standards, I don't write the specs. What I do is I either design or enforce the process by which their publications and consensus actually happen. So what I'm going to talk about today is about what the standardization process looks like across different standard development organizations, or SDOs. Now, of course, it being standards, why would we standardize on what that's called? Because you may be more familiar with hearing this as a standard setting organization, or a standards body, or a standards organization. All those terms are accurate and true. Now, at the highest level, it is kind of all the same. You get someone who has an idea in their head, they write it down, and either implicitly through adoption or explicitly through a consensus process, consensus is reached, a document is published, voila, you have a standard. There's a little more in the way of detail, however, in there that's kind of important. So first we'll cover what are the different types of SDOs, and I'll be using some terms that I did not invent, but they are very loosely defined across the industry. As far as I know, there is no formal, globally defined term for what is an SDO. But the other thing that there isn't really a global definition for is what is a standard. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about big S standards versus little s standards. And since we're at an identity conference, I'm going to pay particular attention to where identity and access management, or IAM, standards happen. But even with that focus, I mean, there's a lot of standards organizations in the world, a lot. And I'm not going to get to all of them. We only have 45 minutes. We don't have a couple of days. I've really captured a lot in the speaking notes in these slides. So I'm not expecting you to retain everything I'm going to go through today, because this is a lot of information. It's a master class. It's 45 minutes of several different organizations and how they function. What I want you to take away from this is that, yes, there are differences. Yes, you can sort of classify them. And yes, there's a place where you can go to refer back for information. All right, how many of you kind of are familiar with this cartoon? Yeah, you knew I was going to show this, right? Right? It had to happen. This is a very famous cartoon from the comic XKCD. And I figure it kind of explains why most people are here, because standards just proliferate. For that matter, standards organizations seem to just proliferate. And it seems like it's a never-ending process. So before you have it in your head that you're going to create the next standard or standards organization, let's talk about how that works. So first thing to remember, not all SDOs are the same. There's very important differences in breadth, depth, and participation and adoption. Of course, they're not hard and fast rules, and any standards organization may very well drift from one category to the next over its life. Very little of this is actually static or set in stone. So, stepping up to the bar, we're going to define some terms here. I divide SDOs into 3 separate categories. You've got your treaty-based or government-based SDOs. You've got your industry-based SDOs. And then you've got your de facto or community-based SDOs. Again, many, many more actual organizations that develop standards in our space than are listed here. We can discuss those offline if you want to know something about specific ones. So organizations like ISO, the ITUT, NIST, those fall in the category of treaty-based or government-based organizations. Now, that isn't to say that industry-based SDOs aren't recognized internationally, and sometimes their standards are included in legislation or regulation. But the legality of it all isn't actually a critical part of their existence, right? They do not exist because the treaty said they are going to exist. They don't exist because law say they're going to exist the way treaty-based SDOs do. Now, this is where I put the Internet Engineering Task Force, the IETF, or the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, and so on. Now, de facto or community-based SDOs, those are often near and dear to people's hearts because they're always special purpose, and they're always driven by the passion of a particular community to document what they want, what they believe, what they think needs to happen for interoperability. Now, if a de facto standards organization's material is popular enough and adopted broadly enough, then they may very well shift from being de facto to being an industry-based SDO. So in the de facto space, this is where I put the Kantara initiative, where I put the Decentralized Identity Foundation, the OpenID Foundation, and others. I suspect OpenID Foundation is really going to be shifting into industry-based before too long. It's a continuum. So some common characteristics of treaty-based SDOs are, as I noted, that they are recognized formally by international law, regulation, or treaty. The politics in these organizations are brutal because at no point in time are the discussions they're having purely about technical merit. Nation-state politics absolutely enter into this. If 2 countries are involved in a trade war, that's going to be expressed in the work and whether they're willing to vote to support a particular standard or not. Every word matters, and the participation usually requires sponsorship by a national body or by a liaison organization. That's usually another SDO or a non-government organization, an NGO. Now, these SDOs may, if you're paying close attention, open up their stuff to public comment after it reaches a certain point, but the actual participation in the groups is usually fairly restricted. You can certainly ask to join, and I have, on another project I work with, I had someone come to me and say, I want to work on the mobile driver's license standard in ISO, what do I do? And I say, you go talk to your national representative in Italy, and he did, and he's now participating. So it can be done. But again, remember, the formality of language and process there really matters. I mean, think Robert's Rules of Order in terms of how they act. So while treaty-based SDOs cover a very broad range of topics, it's not unusual for them to partner with other SDOs that fall in the realm of industry or community-based organizations. The example being mobile driver's license, MDL. That area of standards development falls largely with ISO. But the Kantara initiative, a community-based SDO, has developed a report on MDL privacy that fills in some of the blanks not covered by ISO at all. They're doing something on privacy with MDL, which is pretty interesting reading. Now, it's worth noting that the only type of SDO I personally have ever seen charge money for their standards are actually treaty-based. That has always surprised me, because the success of a standard is generally measured by how much is it adopted. And the last thing you want to do is put a barrier between the standard and the people that want to adopt it. Treaty-based organizations don't quite have that same driver, because I don't want to say they don't care, but they know that their standards will be used, will be applied in different regions because, again, treaty law legislation. So they're not quite hungry in the way other SDOs very well may be. Most NDOs actually rely on membership fees and do just leave their documents freely available. But ISO is very interesting. And they also charge in Swiss francs, which is an interesting life choice. Okay, so industry-based SDOs, they may be recognized by international law, but not necessarily. More than likely, their standards will be recognized and referenced, but not the SDO themselves. In fact, some SDOs are not legal entities, so they cannot be formally recognized in that way. The IETF, in fact, only developed an LLC just a few years ago so that it could sign contracts, because before that, the Internet Society did it on their behalf. The IETF, from a purely legal perspective, did not exist. But their standards absolutely were recognized and often referred to in broader contexts. So one of the things that industry-based SDOs have in common is the breadth and depth of the topics they cover. The breadth is probably not nearly as wide as treaty-based SDOs, but they're going to go way deeper. So a good example here is the W3C. Now, the W3C is about web standards. In the grand scheme of things, that's actually a fairly tightly focused scope. But within that scope, they're covering markup languages, they're covering accessibility, they're covering web security, they're covering privacy, they're covering a lot of different material within that scope. They go very, very deep. The IETF, now their scope is what happens, how many of you are familiar with the OSI model? It's a nice way to think about how you layer things, starting from stuff happening actually on the wire and then moving up to what that then looks like in an application. So the IETF focuses roughly starting layer 3, so not so much on the physical aspects of how information is transmitted, but a little bit higher up the stack, for things that come with operating the internet. It sounds kind of a wide scope, but again, when you compare it to treaty-based SDOs, it's actually pretty tight. So again, the business models here have a lot of impact on the development and publication process, because while participation has loopholes for experts to join, formal voting on publication is often, but not always, restricted to a pay-to-play environment. The members are who get to vote. The members are who get to call consensus, and while there may be other participants, they don't get to have a say in that aspect of the process. Now, the IETF is an outlier on this one a little bit, because there's no paying membership for the IETF. So if you're at all interested in like OAuth standards, all you have to do is literally show up on a mailing list. You don't even have to go to an in-person meeting. They don't have members. They have participants. It's a role that's freely open, and they do have sponsors. But the sponsors primarily get and we thank you for your support. That's pretty much all they get out of the whole thing. They might get their logo on some stuff, but they do not get any seat at the leadership table because they are sponsors. Doesn't happen. Okay, so de facto standards organizations. These truly are the favorite. These are the ones we love and know because they often come because we, as a community, have a problem we're trying to solve. Now, they generally actually spin up in one of three separate ways. One pretty common way is because they look at the other established SDOs in the space and say, oh my God, this is so slow. This is so painful. This is taking too long and it's too restricted and I can't stand it. I'm going to go out and I'm going to show them how to do it right. And you know, the W3C, that's exactly how it formed because Sir Tim Berners-Lee felt the IETF was too slow. I can't actually argue with him on that. Now, the Web Hypertext Application Technology Working Group, commonly known as the WHAT-WG, it formed a few years back because it decided that the IETF and the W3C were too slow. Okay, so sure, a group spins off, they go faster, but then they realize they actually need an established process. And they need IPR rules, which means they need lawyers, which means they need money, which means they need a business model. And then they become one of the two slow SDOs out there, and the other SDOs literally laugh at them because they knew that was going to happen. There's the lack of speed is actually there for a reason. But that was one way. Another way that these kinds of SDOs form is because innovation is being blocked by traditional thinking. So you have a group that really believes in their stuff, but they can't find a home for it. The other organizations are going, that's cute. No, I don't think so. So the Decentralized Identity Foundation, that's pretty much on this path. I think, but I would really want to double check with the founders, that FIDO may very well have formed this way too. So a third way that a de facto SDO forms is that a group just starts publishing stuff and people just start referring to that stuff. The organization may not even have it in their heads that they want to be a standards organization. It's the community pretty much decides and puts them on that pedestal, and there they go. So one group I work with is called REFEDS. That's the Research and Education Federation community. It's all SAML Federation stuff in the academic world. And they produce templates, they produce best practice guidance documents for those academic SAML federations. Everybody points to them in that space because they are the arbiter for good taste. Do they think of themselves as an SDO? No, but are they in reality? Yeah, they really are. So I would consider IDPro is on that path. It's not there yet, but you can see how it's starting to move into the space of de facto SDO, and I'll go into a lot more detail on that later. I personally find this like the most fun because you can see this start to happen and you can get in on the ground floor of really molding an organization to be that leader in a space. And it's passion and technical merit. So, as you can probably guess, given that I've been working in the standards space for well over a decade, I can be kind of picky when it comes to how words are used. I like words. I like them to be used in an unambiguous fashion. One of my pet peeves is the very ambiguous use of the word standard. There's no getting around that ambiguity in human language is a thing. You cannot always be precise because communication is actually sometimes more important than the precision. But I'm still going to spend just a little bit of time on how I see the differences. So a little less standard. It's a lovely noun to use. It's great. It's a great bucket term that anything that's commonly referred to as the go-to model for what a thing should be is there it is. There's your description. There's your standard. So it's not wrong to use the word to describe these documents that everybody relies on as a thing. But the term is imprecise because, like for me personally, I never know if they're referring to something that went through. Did this go through a consensus process? Are there actual implementations out there that can be referred to, or what is this? Why are you calling it a standard? I don't understand. So even the use of the phrase standards development organization, there's some argument about can an organization be called an SDO, if they don't formally have standards that are recognized by somebody else. I don't know. I think that's kind of silly at that point, because for that to be true, everybody would have to know how the standards are being developed at that organization. And if everybody knew all of that, this session would never have been accepted at Identiverse, because y'all would know. So communication is it's just never pure, because, you know, humans are not the most tidy of creatures. They're not always logical. So I would just leave this as an awareness moment. If someone starts referring to standards, maybe it would be a good time to just ask real quick, what exactly do they mean by that? So if little s standards are a general categorization of things, what are big S standards? So my favorite definition does come out of the IETF, and it's about consensus and demonstrated implementations. A big S standard almost always has quite a bit of process behind it. At least some significant component of the organization that's doing the publishing had to come to consensus on it. And there is proof that at least somebody out there has done independent implementations to say, yes, this thing is going to work. It's worth noting, however, that some SDOs don't have that last requirement, that there has to be independent implementations. A few years back, the US National Information Standards Organization published a standard called Espresso. This is a long one, I have to read this. Espresso stands for Establishing Suggested Practices Regarding Single Sign-On. Yeah. I would call that an ivory tower exercise, because they got a bunch of really smart, really well-intentioned people in the room where they said, well, in an ideal world, we think it should look like this. And they finished it, and they published it, and no one ever used it again, including the people that wrote it. So having implementations is usually, in my mind, a better practice, but it's not always the case that that will happen. So for our discussion, a standard is going to describe what to do. It's not necessarily going to describe how to do it. That's where things like best practice documents or reports or some of the other material that SDOs often publish come into play. So just to make things a little bit more challenging, because did I mention that humans are kind of untidy, some organizations they don't even want to call their stuff standards at all. Instead, they will use entirely different terms. The W3C is really big on this one. They don't call their standard-like things standards. They call them recommendations. But regardless, recommendations still require a formal process to declare consensus. They require independent implementations. And there are a host of other documents that the W3C then publishes. But the criteria for them are different. They publish technical reports, they publish working drafts, they publish candidate recommendations, they publish proposed recommendations, they published working group or interest group or community group notes. That's a capital N for notes. And yes, I'm afraid that this actually really matters. The fact that they do publish more than just standards, because just because a document has been published by an SDO does not mean that is something you should base your product on. Though you can have some fun with your vendors if you really want to. For example, I know of some organizations that have put in their RFPs, formal RFPs out to the world, do you support RFC 1149? And if they come back with why, yes, of course we support, because we support RFCs, well then congratulations, you are about to get your IP data packets delivered to you via carrier pigeon. Because the RFC series has a whole group of April 1st RFCs that they're humor, they're fun. And so, you know, just because the RFC series has these does not mean that this is something that you should actually be, you know, building your products on. Okay, so we've covered different type of SDOs and different type of outputs from those SDOs. So now let's talk about some of the IAM standards. So ISO, properly known as the International Organization for Standards, or also an accurate, correct name is the Organización Internacional de Normalización, or the equivalent in Russian, which I can't say. That's because English, French, and Russian are the official languages of ISO. Now, ISO has been around since 1947, and you may notice that ISO does not, in fact, match the first letters of any of the names that they are officially called. So why is that? Well, that's because the founders couldn't decide which one to choose, because heavens forfend that they give priority to French or English or Russian. And so their story, and they're sticking to it, is that they decided to use ISO because it is derived from the Greek word isos, which means equal. Now that's on the internet, so it must be true. Now, ISO standards provide for everything except electrical and electronic engineering. They do everything else except those two things. Standards in those areas are covered by the International Electrotechnical Commission, or IEC. And where there's sort of an overlap between the two, that's where you start to see the ISO/IEC standards. And that's actually very, very common in information technology standards. I don't actually know of any of the IT standards that ISO has that isn't done jointly with the IEC. So to be involved in developing ISO standards, you must be sponsored by a national member or a liaison member. Again, that might be another SDO or a non-government organization that's signed very particular agreements. Often, the people that are coming in that way don't have voting rights, only the national members do. They do have a list of people to contact on their website, and as I noted earlier when talking about treaty-based SDOs in general, the process here really, really matters. The work is not just about technical merit, because the nation-state politics are going to enter into the room whether you want them to or not. ISO standards are formally reviewed by the associated technical committees every 5 years. The technical committee decides if, at the 5-year mark, is there any work to do? If yes, then it breaks that work into new work item proposals. It assigns the different work items to special subcommittees, or SCs. They then, they work on that, they vote until they've declared consensus, and then they release it to ISO members for a 2-month review period. Most standards organizations don't have that level of formality in review because they don't have the resources to do it. This is actually where some of the business model aspects come into this. Standards organizations don't usually make a lot of money. So of all of the standards organizations out there, I almost certainly know the most about the IETF. And let me tell you, they are a very quirky bunch of people. A founding belief for the organization is that we reject kings, presidents, and voting. We believe in rough consensus and running code. The IETF is just this dichotomy of rugged individualism and the fact that the only people that go, or at least the majority of people that go, are funded by large organizations, and so they are, in effect, representing those organizations' interests, but everyone tries to pretend, no, it's about the individual. So there is some effort to balance those kinds of extremes by limiting how many people from any given organization can sit on the leadership groups, particularly the Internet Engineering Steering Group, the IESG, or the Internet Architecture Board, the IAB. But there's no getting around that people do represent their organization's interests, and there's no limit to how many people can participate in any given working group from one organization. Google is rather famous for just how many people can flood a working group to sort of just make sure that things are going kind of the way they want to. Now, there are a lot of IAM-related working groups and work going on in the IETF. I mean, if you consider authentication and authorization of things as well as people in the domain of IAM, then by golly, there's work happening here across the board. Now, that said, I regularly observe a gap in the expertise of the people participating in the working groups that are touching on IAM topics. I'll give you an example. There's a working group called Regext. That's basically short for Registration Extensions. It's a very DNS-focused working group. And they have a draft that they've been working on called the Federated Authentication for the Registration Data Access Protocol using OpenID Connect. I'm very proud of them. They did not reinvent the wheel. They did their research. They found something out there that would work for them. And they have, pretty much no OAuth or OpenID experts in the group. And they have asked for help. for review. Did we get it right? And the answer has usually been kind of silence. And I get that. I mean, there's a lot of work out there to do and not enough people to do it. And so when you do go to the OAuth working group or whatnot, they've got a whole cast of documents they're already trying to work on. You know, they don't have time to help with all the others. And I want y'all to hold that thought for when I get to the why we need you to participate in the standards process. So the W3C is another SDO that has a lot of work happening in the IAM space. This is largely, but not entirely, a pay-to-play organization. Voting on outputs does require membership, and membership requires money. I think this might be the most complicated membership fee structure of any of the SDOs I'm aware of, because they base it on where are you in the world and how are you classified from an economic perspective, and are you a nonprofit, and are you a first-time member, and how much money exactly does your company make? Is it this much or this much or this much or that much? So for the US, that means you've got a range of membership fees from $2,250 to $77,000. Now that said, invited experts are a path in to actually have influence on the standards, and anyone that's willing to do, take that step and hold the pen. Now, as someone who frequently takes notes and edits documents, I can assure you that holding that pen gives you a lot of influence on what the standard's going to come out to be. So the W3C was founded in 1994, .com era for the win, and for many years it was actually a benevolent dictatorship, because the founder, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, he held absolute veto power. It could go through all of the consensus process in the world, and if Sir Tim didn't like it, it was not published. They have subsequently changed that as he got older and they realized that, the cult of personality might not be a good idea. But, his influence on some of the original standards is pretty significant. So work these days often starts in a community group. And the good news about community groups is membership in those is absolutely free. Anybody can join a community group. This is the ground floor for testing out an idea, for incubating an idea and seeing if it will work, if there's hunger in the world to actually adopt that thing. So two particular community groups I would like to draw your attention to is the Privacy Community Group, Privacy CG, or the Federated Identity Community Group, the FedID CG. These groups are one of the very, very few places where identity people and browser people actually overlap. And browser vendors, they have kind of different priorities than IAM people do. So, and I'm not saying those priorities are wrong, they're not. But they are different, and that really shows in what they propose in terms of the browsers have to be seen to do something to protect privacy and prevent tracking on the web. I respect that. But that means they're probably going to break identity flows. Oops. I think this area more than any other needs some serious cross-engagement. All right, so let's talk about some of the more immediately influential de facto standards organizations, starting with the OpenID Foundation. So formed in 2007, the OpenID Foundation does require membership, but the fees are far more approachable than for the W3C. They range from $50 for individuals to $20,000 for large organizations. They also have a funding stream associated with their compliance certifications. These compliance certifications, they're not uncommon, where the SDO says, we're going to set up a test infrastructure for you to validate whether your stuff actually complies with the standard. But it's not all that common either. ISO certification, that's a very well-known thing, but that's all done by third parties. The W3C, they thought about offering some compliance certifications and decided that that was just way more trouble than it was worth. It wasn't actually going to help the community because there were so many ways you could implement something. They just didn't have the resources to figure that out. The IETF has hackathons that serve as like their interoperability days and tests, but nothing formal comes out of those That's just a let's get together and hack code and see if this stuff works. So I get all of that because, you know, a standard or even a set of standards has to be very clearly specified in order to write tests against it for this kind of compliance work. And given how many open source projects I've been involved in where you cannot get people to even write their test cases in GitHub, you know, whole compliance programs are pretty heavyweight to put together. So, I mean, given the prevalence and impact of OpenID Connect in the world, this small SDO has a lot of impact, and they're very nice people. I like them very much. Okay, FIDO Alliance. So the FIDO Alliance is actually one of the newer SDOs out there. They were formed only in 2013, and goodness knows they have come a long way in terms of the influence they have on the industry. Membership in FIDO, cost-wise, is about on par with the W3C. There's a board level for $50,000, sponsor level for $25,000, government level, associate level, you know, and so on. The rights, responsibilities, and privileges with each level of membership, they are fairly hierarchical, and they have this like 2-page table of what group can do which things based on their membership levels. The only thing that any member can do, regardless of membership, involves benefits like how they can go to at least one FIDO meeting for free. Or there's some various allowances made when it comes to royalty-free and non-assert licenses for the use of FIDO specifications. Their whole IPR policy and how things are licensed is a little more complicated than most of the other SDOs I've seen. That's something that you would want to really look at their website and learn more about. You know, again, as with some of the other SDOs, FIDO does produce more than one type of document. They have their specifications that act as kind of the standards that we know and love, but they also have things called requirements and other publications. I love that. They put that in capital letters in their membership agreement, other publications. Now, specifications actually have some additional categories, including proposed standard specification. And they describe a specification as a document that contains technical criteria, including reference to existing specs and protocols, in any state of progress within a FIDO Alliance technical working group. Okay. Requirements, however, I think this is the only standards organization I know that really does this on purpose, that actually says we are going to have a requirements document that will exist as a first order artifact so that people can come in later and say, what were you thinking? Look, we have our requirements list. So it's a very clever thing on their part to do that kind of thing. All of this is described in detail in their very long membership agreement, which I think is like 24 or 25 pages. One of the things that can make understanding where do IAM standards come from kind of complicated is just how interrelated the work can be between one SDO and the next. So WebAuthn, I'm pretty sure you've all heard of WebAuthn. That was jointly published with the W3C. So they call it a W3C standard, but you go to the FIDO website and there it is right there too. Similarly, so is the Client to Authenticator Protocol, or CTAP. That's also jointly published with the W3C. And that kind of overlap happens pretty regularly as groups leverage expertise and relationships from one topic and organization to another. Now, FIDO is one of those organizations that has a certification program so that you can actually test your stuff against their specifications, you know, for a small fee. They actually have several different types of certifications at different levels, like different levels of complexity, from like, okay, are you functionally interoperating with our spec? Yes, great. Are you certified authenticators? Now you're starting to get into some of the fun hardware. And then, you know, biometric components, they actually will certify against that as well. So I'm going to include Oasis. How many of you have heard of Oasis? Awesome. So as much as people want to light SAML on fire, it's actually a really prevalent standard in the IAM space. But maintenance of that standard went on hiatus for several years. And so, you know, one of the many reasons people were saying SAML is dead. So SAML does actually live in the land of Oasis, which is a pretty broad SDO in and of itself. So Oasis stands for the Organization for Advancement of Structured Information Standards. I mean, given that as a title, no wonder SAML lives there. It is a membership-driven SDO. Membership happens, again, at different levels. That's a pretty common theme when you're looking at these kinds of membership things. And they divide the memberships into contributors and general sponsors. Now, much to my amusement, they do have a premier level, but they don't tell you how much that one costs. And I'm pretty sure it's if you have to ask, you can't afford it. So contributors, they can provide they fully participate in the technical committees that Oasis puts together. And the fees range from $1,150 up to $11,500. General sponsor, they get the addition of more visibility, marketing benefits. Look, I'm participating in a standards organization. And the fees there range from just under $14,000 to just over $22,000. So Oasis standards are maintained by technical committees. Once an organization is an Oasis member, they actually have an unlimited how many people they can sponsor to work in a working group. And that actually has implications for SAML, as it turns out. One becomes a voting member in a technical committee by showing up to 3 consecutive meetings. Now, these can be video conference calls, but 3 consecutive ones, you are now allowed to vote within that technical committee. In the case of SAML, that standard, as I said, essentially went dormant because the technical committee got really frustrated. They couldn't meet Oasis's requirements for consensus and adoption. They were very, very strict, very hard requirements to get through. A few years back, Oasis changed the rules, made it a little bit easier to get through the process, at which point the higher education community stepped up and said, thank you, can we finally get these errata fixed? And they did. They updated the spec. I think it's like now at 2.1 actually, and did a few other changes like putting in subject ID and pairwise ID, things like that. So a note about, we're going to use Oasis as an example here. Most SDOs are not responsible for making sure that their standard is adopted. If the standard doesn't have adoption and people aren't participating in the group, then from an SDO's perspective, unless they have an extensive business model that gives them more money than they know what to do with, ISO, then that's seen as the world voting with its feet, and this becomes a dormant standard. So it may be held up there for legacy reasons, but the standards organization isn't, they don't care. They're not going to say, no, we've got to keep it going, we've got to keep it live. That's not their job. They'll leave that document for just purely there for legacy support, and then unless people have energy to then do something about it, it will stay there in perpetuity. So let's talk about IDPro, because I am the IDPro principal editor, and I think that this is a really good example of something that could become a de facto standards organization. So what IDPro has that makes it start to smell like a de facto SDO is the body of knowledge. The body of knowledge is being developed by a, check, small focused community. The topic here, tightly focused, check. The business model, membership driven, check. Outputs, freely available, check. Now, all that said, ISO isn't there yet as a de facto SDO because the body of knowledge is not yet widely referenced. It's getting there. Most people have heard about it at this point, but it's not widely referenced yet. It's not complete enough yet. It actually doesn't have enough material in there. Right now, it's still largely introductory information. And third is so many of these standards are because the community has come together to write the thing. That's not what's happening here usually. Usually it's 1 or 2 people decide to write a thing, and it goes through a significant review process. There's subject matter experts serve as peer reviewers, at least 2 of those. Then there are 2 committees, including the Body of Knowledge Committee and the IDPro board, will come in and they will review it from a couple of different perspectives, and then it gets published, and there's a copy in GitHub. so that we can collect issues and that the community can then start chiming in on it. So there's a lot of potential here for this is how a de facto SDO starts. Whether it will get there, I don't know. It was never in the board's mind that that's where they were trying to get to, but again, that's what makes a de facto SDO, when the community decides, not so much when the organization itself does. Shameless plug moment. Since this is by and for the IAM community, you can be a part of making this particular resource better. I have a whole list of topics that I think need to be dealt with in the body of knowledge. And I'm at a conference full of people who have the subject matter expertise to be writing the stuff that we need to have in there. So if you are willing to write, that's great. If you're not willing to write, that's still okay, because I also need reviewers. I love having a good, rich pool of reviewers because it gives you a much, more diverse set of understanding and interest in looking at how things are going to be described and consumed. So, if you couldn't tell, that was the lead-in to my pitch as to why all this actually matters to you as IAM practitioners in a world that's increasingly reliant on identity and access management related things. So this is going to sound like a really bizarre segue, but hear me out, it has relevance. I'm going to tell you a story about a conversation I had with an individual at an Internet Engineering Steering Group meeting. So during a break from talking about the role of the IETF in the world, one of the folks came up to me and said, no context, mind you, right? We were just there for coffee. He comes up to me and he says, so, which IPv6 protocol do you think should succeed in the world? I have no idea. This is not my area of expertise. I don't know why you're asking me. I'm the publisher of documents. I have nothing to do with that level of work. But that's not what I said. What I said was, well, if I were queen of the universe, I'd send both of those things out to Africa and see which one works in that environment. Because the infrastructure there, wildly different than what you generally find in the US and Europe. The electrical power, very inconsistent. Users generally rely on mobile devices as their sole computer. That's it, that's all they got. And throwing in a little bit of identity and access management components, the source of truth data, the quality of it is mixed at best. In fact, it may not even exist. So I want to know what proposal works best outside of the Silicon Valleys of the world. And this guy thought I was brilliant. It was so depressing. It never occurred to him that as having a way to determine whether something was going to be globally viable. People pull from their experiences. So this whole test in Africa idea came about in part because I had just returned from a trip in Senegal, where I spent most of my time at that conference listening to the kind of technology and identity-related challenges they were facing. And the people in the IASG meeting that day were almost entirely from the US and Europe, a couple folks from Australia and New Zealand. They were pulling from their experiences, and their experiences were very limited. The world of standards is exactly like that. But it's not just lack of diversity in terms of ethnicity or gender or culture. I mean, those are certainly significant. But there's a lack of diversity in practitioners. People who write standards are very rarely the people who implement the standards. And that shows sometimes in those of you poor souls who have to implement things like WebRTC. I don't know how you could possibly do it, because I know how those standards were put together and they're impossible. So I'll give you another example that's relevant right this minute. How many of you have heard Vittorio Bertocci, Tim Capelli, or even me talking about how browser changes are going to impact identity flows? Cool. They're going to impact them hard. So the browsers have to do something to stop unintended tracking of users, and that is going to break OAuth, OpenID Connect, and SAML. They're starting with cookies, which is, SAML doesn't care about cookies so much, but OpenID and OAuth do. And that's just the first step. They're also going to start working on link decoration, bounce redirects, and wow, talk about breaking identity flows. But how many people that actually understand all of that and can test what the browsers are doing show up to where the browser vendors are? They don't. It's very, very few, and that's just very not okay. The standards that you are implementing and that you are going to be subject to need your experience as developers to make sure that they meet your needs. And no one will ever know your needs better than you do. So yeah, the standards process takes a notoriously long time. So the best time to participate, absolutely, it was a good 20 years ago, but as they say, the second best time is now. So there's room for all different levels of participation. I'm not saying that, you know, if you're not ready for some strange reason to engage at a nation state level, then don't. Offer your expertise as an invited expert. If you're not ready to be an invited expert, that's okay. Join a community group and help incubate ideas. And if you're trying to just learn on the topic, no problem. Then write something for the IDPro body of knowledge, because often, you know, you learn so much when you actually try and teach it to someone else by writing it all down. Each and every SDO does usually have a description of how you can participate, and if you can't find it, find someone that's working in that group or the working group chair. That's almost always much easier to find, and just contact them and say, I'm interested, what can I do? And they will help you get there. So if you're still not convinced, or better yet, you really want to know a little bit more about standards development in an org working on several key IAM standards, join me and Vittorio tomorrow. We've got a session going. I think I'm not sure if it's at 11 or 11:25, but it's in that range of things. And we're going to talk about his real life experiences in actually producing a standard, and I hope you get to go. With that, I have no what time. Let's see, it's 12:21. I think that means lunch, but you are welcome to ask me questions, all, you know, in my great crowded room. Espen.
I saw you mentioned RFCs. So I was just wondering, RFCs, are those just used across all the standards?
RFCs are an IETF, well, so the RFC series publishes documents primarily from the IETF, but not exclusively. They also publish documents from the Internet Research Task Force, from the Internet Architecture Board, and through what's called an independent submission process. In order to figure out what group is behind what RFC, you actually have to look at the RFC and it will say it in the metadata. It's both, I actually understand why they're called RFCs, because originally, back in the day, it was truly a request for comment. People just throwing the idea out there and saying, we want someone to comment on this. These days, it's one of those acronyms that's now its own word. It's an RFC. Other standards organizations, they will use their own terms. I don't usually see them referred to as RFCs, only out of the IETF, IAB, and IRTF. Any other questions? All right, thank you for coming. Oh, did you have one?
Like a good point this morning from one of the talks when the presenter talked about going to a library and getting them as stakeholders, because they're the people who deal with, I guess, like the most general, like lay people, the most general population. I guess it's similar to like go to a continent or a country that doesn't have the same infrastructure to implement and get feedback from them. Is there a push on these bodies to do that?
Yes and no. If you ask them, they will say, yes, absolutely, we want that. Are they actually particularly open to it when the person shows up in the room? Often not, because there is an assumption that you are at least this tall. You have read the spec and you understand the spec. Okay, in a way, that's a really high bar. So someone like me, I am by training a librarian with a medieval English history background. When I got involved in tech, particularly in the kinds of roles I play now, it was with the idea of, okay, I can never do what these spec writers do. No way, not going to happen. So what can I do? I approached it that way, and now I've been doing this for 12 years as a career, and I don't know anyone else that does what I do. It's hard to make that bridge and to feel perfectly comfortable in the kind of space of, Yeah, okay, I'm surrounded by people far geekier than I will ever be. Totally cool with that. It's not a typical skill set.
What about the hackathons? Like we thought IETF has their hackathons, but who do they invite in those hackathons to test what they're working on?
They keep it open, but whoever hears about it is usually the people who participate in the meetings. Yeah,
Communication marketing probably mostly.
possibly, possibly. You had a question, sir.
It's just more, I went to one OAuth call
Uh-huh.
in IAM and I got put as the note taker.
Yep.
Which was just the worst possible place for a newbie to like be there, but no one else was doing it.
Yep.
So, is there something is that, and I'm actually on the Fed ID mailing list with you. Thank you for all the work you do. Is that more friendly than the OAuth group? Is my question.
I sure hope so. If it's not, tell me so I can fix it.
I haven't been on any calls.
Yeah. So the W3C and the IETF in particular really drive from community source, and so they don't have staff at the meetings. So all notes are taken by meeting participants. And there is almost always that awkward silence at the beginning going, do I have anyone willing to take notes? Anybody? Bueller? Nothing. But what I see is when someone does step up and say, I'm going to take notes, other people will actually help doing that kind of thing. So, any other questions? All right, thank you for coming. Enjoy your lunch. Have a great rest of your conference.